You probably remember August of 2021. The images were all over our screens, and they were just shocking. The Taliban sweeping into Kabul. People desperate, clinging to planes as they were taking off. A government that had been in power for 20 years just seemed to vanish overnight. The whole thing was just stunning.
And that was the feeling at the very top. The story that quickly took hold was that this was a sudden, totally unpredictable failure. You heard it everywhere, an 11-day collapse that somehow caught the world's best intelligence agencies completely off guard.
But here's the thing. What if that story, the one we all heard about, the 11-day collapse, isn't really the whole picture? What if the real story is longer, more complicated, and what if that final fall wasn't a surprise at all, but was actually inevitable? Okay, let's get into it.
So yeah, that whole 11-day collapse idea, it makes for a good headline, but it's mostly a myth. The reality was more like a slow-motion collapse, a 4-month-long domino effect that was really just the final chapter of a story with cracks that had been forming for years.
To really get how this all fell apart, we've got to rewind the clock a bit, back to February 2020, because that's when a deal was made that completely changed the game in Afghanistan, and crucially, a deal where the Afghan government itself was left sitting on the sidelines. This was the Doha Agreement. It basically set a hard deadline for the U.S. to pull all its troops out. Now, in exchange, the Taliban made some promises about security. But here's the kicker, the really critical part. The actual Afghan government wasn't even at the negotiating table. To top it off, the deal also pressured that same government to release 5,000 hardened Taliban fighters from prison, basically reinforcing their enemy just as their main ally was heading for the door.
Now, the Doha Agreement didn't create the problems inside the Afghan army, but man, did it expose them in the worst way possible. For years, the Afghan security forces, the ANDSF, had basically been on life support, and that plug was about to get pulled.
I mean, the ANDSF was just riddled with problems, top to bottom. They'd been losing ground to the Taliban every single year since 2015. Their whole strategy was defensive, just reacting to attacks. Corruption was out of control. Commanders were literally stealing their own soldiers' salaries. So of course, morale was just in the gutter. But maybe the biggest ticking time bomb, the one almost nobody was talking about, was this quiet, technical detail: their total dependence on foreign contractors.
And when you look at the numbers here, it is just wow. In 2020, a staggering 81%, a full 4/5 of all their vehicle maintenance was done by outsiders. They literally couldn't keep their own trucks and Humvees on the road by themselves.
So what happens when those contractors pack their bags and leave, which they did when the final withdrawal was announced? The consequences were, frankly, catastrophic. The Afghan Air Force's Black Hawk helicopters, their most important asset, saw their readiness rate get cut almost in half, just like that. Their eyes in the sky? They were basically grounded.
So you've got this one side that's literally falling apart at the seams. And on the other side, the Taliban were running an absolute masterclass in strategy. They knew exactly where the weak points were, and they designed a plan to exploit every single one. And you can really see the strategic mismatch right here. The Afghan army was static, spread thin across thousands of checkpoints, basically sitting ducks. The Taliban, on the other hand, used what's been called a flowing water strategy. And that's a perfect name for it. They didn't just run headfirst into the strongest government positions. No way. They attacked everywhere at once, stretching the government forces thin, and they just flowed around the tough spots, cutting off roads and isolating their enemy.
But you know, their deadliest weapon, it wasn't a gun. It was psychological warfare. The whole thing was brilliant in a brutal way. First, they'd cut the roads to a government outpost, isolating it. Then they'd send in local village elders with a really simple choice: surrender or you'll all be killed. For soldiers who were running out of food, low on ammo, and hadn't been paid in months, the offer to just lay down their weapons and go home safely was often impossible to refuse. And the Taliban filmed every surrender, then blasted it all over social media to build this story that their victory was inevitable.
Okay, so the stage is set, right? You have a demoralized army, a brilliant Taliban game plan, and the U.S. is packing up. So let's watch how this actually played out. Not in 11 days, but over 4 very crucial months.
So look at this map. This is April 13th. This is the day before the final U.S. withdrawal gets announced. The Taliban already control a huge chunk of the country. The government's really only in full control of about 1/3 of the districts. The slow-motion siege of the country was already well underway.
Now, fast forward just 2 months to mid-June. Look at the difference. That flowing water strategy, it is working. The Taliban are just gobbling up rural districts, and they're starting to tighten the noose around all the major cities.
And by the end of July, the whole chessboard has been transformed. It's basically game over for the countryside. The government is now just clinging to these isolated islands, the provincial cities, that are now all completely surrounded and under siege.
And this quote from a deputy police chief in Kunduz, it just hits you. It takes all this high-level strategy and brings it right down to the human cost. These guys were just spent. They were exhausted. They fought and fought for weeks, but with no backup, no air support, and supplies running out, their will to keep fighting just disappeared.
And this is where that whole 11-day collapse story comes from. With the countryside already gone and the army totally broken, the final fall of the cities happened at lightning speed. Once that first provincial capital fell on August 6th, the psychological dam just broke. Major cities that had held out for months suddenly surrendered in a few hours. It all culminated with the president fleeing the country and the Taliban just walking into Kabul without firing a shot.
So you step back and you ask yourself, how does a 20-year, multi-trillion-dollar project end like this? It's a tough question, but the sources we looked at are pretty clear on one thing. And that's really the key takeaway here. There's no single villain. There's no one person or one decision you can point to and say, that's it, that's the reason. It was a cascade of failures, years in the making. As Dr. Jonathan Schroden put it, this failure had many fathers.
It was just this perfect storm of failure. You had Afghan leadership that was corrupt and frankly in denial. You had a U.S. policy that basically pulled the rug out from under its own ally. You had an Afghan army that was built on a fatally flawed foundation. And then you had a Taliban that just outfought and outfought everybody. Each one of these things made the others worse.
So no, the collapse didn't happen in 11 days. It happened over 4 months, starting the moment the U.S. fully committed to leaving. And that reality leaves us with a really big, really uncomfortable question. What are the lessons here? What does it all mean when 2 decades of nation building can be completely unwound in a single summer?